Mr. Speaker, we've been hearing from stakeholders that presenters on first contract arbitration who are scheduled to present tomorrow night have been told to move their presentations to the Law Amendments Committee to this evening, or they are out of luck. Mr. Speaker, the Law Amendments Committee is the opportunity that all Nova Scotians get to have their voice heard on the government's agenda, and this Premier is now putting a muzzle on debate over this contentious issue. We've been hearing from presenter after presenter, hour after hour, that the Premier is wrong to push this Labour agenda, and it seems that the Premier is tired of hearing from Nova Scotians about how we should focus on job growth and the economy rather than trying to fix a problem that simply doesn't exist. And my question to the Premier is, why is the Premier curtailing public debate on first contract arbitration?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, we're not, Mr. Speaker. There's time in the committee to hear presentations today. None of the current presenters have had their time frames changed at all. We're all here in the regular order, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, with the different time, we hope to be able to get through the presentations this evening and get on to amendments, and that, of course, is the work of the House.
Honourable the member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in the words of the Premier, that's simply not true. Mr. Speaker, presenters were told that they would be heard on Thursday evening at the Law Amendments Committee, only to get phone calls today from Legislative Council office under directions from this government telling them, get them in tonight or they're out of luck. Mr. Speaker, it is clear that the Premier has grown tired of hearing from Nova Scotia's largest employers about their concerns that this legislation will have on the Nova Scotia economy at a time when we are hearing of record job losses around this province. Mr. Speaker, the Law Amendments Committee is the one opportunity that all Nova Scotians, regardless of their position on government legislation, have the opportunity to come forward and have their matters heard. So my question again to the Premier is, why are you trying to muzzle debate from Nova Scotians and Nova Scotia's largest employers on first contract arbitration?
Order, please. Order, please. I will read a ruling in the edition of the House of Commons procedures, and I'll quote from that on page 106, chapter 11. Questions seeking information and the schedule and agenda of committees may be directed to chairs of committees. Questions to the ministers or to the committee chair concerning the proceedings or work of a committee, including its order of reference, may not be raised. Thus, for example, a question would be disallowed if dealt with a vote in the committee. With the attendance of the testimony of members at the committee meeting or with the context of the committee report. When a question has been asked of a committee proceedings, Speaker have encouraged members to rephrase their questions. I'll ask you to rephrase your question. I will ask you to rephrase your questions, please.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians' largest employers are coming out and expressing concerns over this government's move to change the labour laws of Nova Scotia at a time when they're seeking this government to show leadership on job growth and protecting the jobs that we have in this province. My question is, why is the Premier continuing to push forward on labour law changes at a time when Nova Scotia employers are clearly saying it is not the right time?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are working with all of the companies across this province to build a stronger economy, to create jobs, Mr. Speaker. That's why you see projects like the Lower Churchill going ahead. That's why you see projects like the Irving contract to build the new combat vessels going ahead, Mr. Speaker. That is why you see good, constructive legislation coming forward to strengthen our economy, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, in my 13 years in the legislature, the same amount of time as the Premier, I have never seen Sobeys come before any committee of this House to raise concerns over government legislation. I have never seen Michelin take the time to express concern over the direction of this government. And tonight, we will have the opportunity. To date, we have only heard a one-sided conversation the Premier had with Michelin. Tonight, we might get to hear exactly what was said to the Premier about first contract arbitration. Mr. Speaker, it is clear that Nova Scotia businesses are concerned with where this government is going. They want to see the government focus on job growth and the economy rather than trying to fix a problem that simply doesn't exist. So will the Premier Will the Premier advise today why his government is so determined to move forward on first contract arbitration in light of the opposition from Nova Scotians' largest employers?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Any of the employers that operate in any of the provinces outside of Atlantic Canada likely already operate in jurisdictions that have first contract legislation. 85% of Canadians are already covered by first contract legislation. Mr. Speaker, what it does is it prevents unnecessary employment stoppages, Mr. Speaker. It strengthens and makes more productive the economy of the province, Mr. Speaker. That's what the legislation does.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today is a shameful day in this legislature when the government is determined to squelch the voices of those who want to risk capital, want to create jobs, want to employ a few Nova Scotians, when they shut down the very mechanism that we use in this chamber to hear the voice of Nova Scotians when it comes to legislation before this House. It's a shameful day, but, Mr. Speaker, it is not the first time that this has happened. In a recent submission to the original sham committee, the Labour Management Review Committee, the Employers Roundtable, which represents thousands of Nova Scotia jobs, warned the government that, I quote, "This will be viewed negatively for companies looking to locate or expand in Nova Scotia." The Employers Roundtable includes Michelin, one of the very companies that today the government is trying to shut up, Mr. Speaker. But that's not all. Sobeys, just the other day, warned the government that this move would be a mark against Nova Scotia when they are considering investing and creating more jobs in our province. Mr. Speaker, Sobeys currently employs over 1,000 Nova Scotians, but wasn't even invited to the Labour Management Review Committee or their study day. These are the voices the government wants to shut up today, and so my question to the Premier is this: will he take leadership and put a stop to the shameful behaviour of his committee chair, his minister, and his government?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we, of course, welcome all those who want to participate in the Law Amendments Committee. We are providing full, open, and adequate time for them to bring their concerns before the committee. We hope that they take advantage of the time that the committee has. We also are hopeful that this evening we'll be able to get through any amendments that might come before the committee, and we can report it back to the House, where the representatives of the people, of course, can debate it.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, that is a shameful answer to a shameful and disgraceful conduct on the part of this government. But more importantly, it is insulting to the employers that bunch is calling today to tell them they can't come tonight as have been scheduled because they don't want to hear for them. That is what's going on, Mr. Speaker, outside this chamber as we speak. When jobs are on the line, the most offensive thing is that the Premier is shutting out the very people who want to come and tell his government why their plan is such a bad idea. Companies like Michelin, Bowater, Clearwater, they're all part of the Employers Roundtable that have come forward to say their plans are a bad idea. When Sobeys was asked to participate in the Labour Management Review Committee, they were told no, Mr. Speaker. Those are the voices they're trying to stifle here today, and so my question to the Premier, if he's truly interested in good legislation and creating jobs in this province, why does he shut out the very people who want to invest in Nova Scotia and create jobs?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, all the people that he has mentioned have either communicated directly with government, have been before the committee, will be before the committee, participated in the Labour Management Review Committee study day. Mr. Speaker, all of them have had a full, ample opportunity to tell the government what their opinion is. Mr. Speaker, what's more, as I pointed out, they all also operate in jurisdictions that have first contract legislation. Why, Mr. Speaker? Because we have decades of experience with first contract legislation. It creates a better working environment for both business and labour, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Graceful answer. The Premier says that he's heard enough, but there is a lineup of people wanting to come and tell his government what they think of his legislation, and he won't let them, Mr. Speaker. That's what's wrong today. But ultimately, Mr. Speaker, companies like Sobeys, companies like Michelin, they have lobbyists, they'll have their say, but what the Premier is trying to stop is that there are thousands of small businesses that don't hire lobbyists, that don't have someone to speak for them. They're the ones that government is calling on the phone today and saying, don't come tonight, we don't want to hear from you. So will the Premier, one last time, if not for Sobeys, if not for Michelin, at least stop this sham and let those thousands of small businesses that he says he doesn't want to hear from come forward and have their say. Do the right thing.
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this has been an open, transparent, comprehensive process, Mr. Speaker, that has invited everyone into the process, whether they are employers, whether they are unions, whether they are small business people, whether they are individual employees. It has been open to everyone.
Order.
The very people.
Order, please. Order. Order, please. Honourable the Premier.
The very people that the leader of the Conservative Party says can't be part of the process are being offered the opportunity to appear before the committee, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. The Premier has made it clear he intends to push through with first contract arbitration agenda, Mr. Speaker, regardless of how many Nova Scotians come before the committee and tell them it is the wrong agenda and it is the wrong time for our province, Mr. Speaker. The Premier has also been misleading Nova Scotians by saying that 86% of Canadians are already covered by this legislation, Mr. Speaker. That is simply untrue, Mr. Speaker. Only Manitoba has this type of first contract arbitration, Mr. Speaker, which is 4% of the Canadian population. My question to the Premier is intent on ramming his agenda through the House. That much is clear. But will the Premier consider a more moderate approach to first contract arbitration?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what I have said is that 85% of Canadians are covered by first contract legislation. Just for the record, that's in Newfoundland, that is in Quebec, that is in Ontario, that is in Saskatchewan, that is in Manitoba, that is in British Columbia, Mr. Speaker. All those provinces have first contract legislation. Why, Mr. Speaker? Because it's good legislation. Mr. Speaker.
Order. Order, please. Order, please. Honourable the Premier.
The reason why we're bringing forward the legislation is because it is the right thing for this province. It is the right thing for the economy, Mr. Speaker. It is the right thing for labour and industrial relations in this province, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're bringing the legislation forward, and that's why this House will pass it.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, with all due respect to the Premier, when an employer that has created 10,000 jobs for Nova Scotians comes and speaks and tell you this is the wrong piece of legislation for Nova Scotians, I believe Nova Scotians would side with that Nova Scotian, not the Premier, who's not created a single job in this province, Mr. Speaker. As a matter of fact, since he's been Premier, 12,500 Nova Scotians have lost their job under his watch, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Labour Management Review Committee couldn't even reach a consensus on whether to recommend any model of first contract arbitration to the Minister. So despite this lack of consensus of whether or not we should even have first contract arbitration, Mr. Speaker, we decide to use the most restrictive model that's in the country, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Premier, if the Labour Management Review Committee could not reach consensus on whether we should even have first contract arbitration, why was the Premier pushing through the most regressive form of first contract arbitration in Canada?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, first to correct the Leader of the Opposition, we're pleased to see 3,000 more jobs created from June of 2009 to June of 2011, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're pleased to work with employers like Irving. We are pleased to work with Newfoundland and Labrador to sign the Lower Churchill Agreement that will create thousands upon thousands of jobs in this province, Mr. Speaker. The largest industrial opportunity in the history of our province. That's the list of accomplishments of this government, Mr. Speaker, and we're proud of them.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the accomplishments of this government is that 12,500 Nova Scotians have lost their jobs under their watch, Mr. Speaker. 14,000 other Nova Scotians have given up even looking for work under this watch, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, all we're asking is for the Premier to listen to the Nova Scotians who have been creating jobs in this province, Mr. Speaker, for decades. When an employer stands in front of a committee of this House and respectfully says that first contract arbitration is not needed in this province, but if the government is content on pushing forward with it, let's look at a less regressive form of first contract arbitration. For the Premier to stand in this House and arrogantly ignore that member of our province, Mr. Speaker, the Premier has a responsibility not just to stand up for his union leader friends, he has a responsibility to stand up for every Nova Scotian who's lost their jobs in this, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Premier is simple. Will you accept amendments to your first contract arbitration?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, the reason why the legislation is before the committee right now is because it is the right thing for every Nova Scotian, Mr. Speaker. It is the right piece of legislation to help with industrial relations. It's been in place for more than 3 decades in many provinces. Why should Nova Scotians be last, Mr. Speaker? Why should we accept that there can be no progress with respect to labour relations? No, Mr. Speaker. We say, Mr. Speaker, that it is time for industrial relations in this province to come into the 21st century, Mr. Speaker. Clear, Mr. Speaker. I have been very clear, and I have said that the job of the Law Amendments Committee is to listen to the presenters who are before them, and if there are good ideas that come forward in that committee, then of course we're prepared to listen.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on a new question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. How much will power rates increase for residential customers on January 1, 2012?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I understand it, it depends on the rate category that they're in, but for residential ratepayers, I think that will be 6.1%, Mr. Speaker. Of course, the reason for that is because we continue to be shackled to fossil fuels in this province, but fortunately, we have a government that has one of the most aggressive renewable energy plans in this country. It's going to get us off fossil fuels and provide long-term stability for electrical rates in this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the URB decided to allow Nova Scotia Power to go back into the pockets of ratepayers, Mr. Speaker, for another 6.1% increase, Mr. Speaker. Plus, Mr. Speaker, there's a 3.2% increase on the fuel adjustment mechanism, Mr. Speaker. Plus, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians, every ratepayer in this province is saddled with the NDP electricity tax, Mr. Speaker, which is also going up on January 1, Mr. Speaker. So in actual fact, Nova Scotians are looking at a double-digit increase in their power bills come January 1, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Premier, how much more gouging from Nova Scotia Power can the people of this province take under your leadership?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, the structure of Nova Scotia Power and Emera were put in place by the Conservatives and Liberal governments over many years, Mr. Speaker. Their reference to the Utility and Review Board, where the way that operates was put in place by those same governments, Mr. Speaker. It is this government that has taken the HST off of home electricity, Mr. Speaker, something that party voted against.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is that party that had increased 1,400 user fees outside of this legislature, Mr. Speaker. It is that Premier that has added the NDP electricity tax to every power bill in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, it is that Premier that increased the HST by 2% on every other thing that Nova Scotians do in this province. Mr. Speaker, rather than trim costs and look for efficiencies, Nova Scotia Power is once again returning to the ratepayers, Mr. Speaker. This monopoly is dictating the energy policies of this province, and the Premier is standing by letting it happen, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia simply cannot afford another rate increase at 10%, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I hear some people chirping from the other side at me. I would encourage them to ask their questions of the Premier and see if they could get an answer from him, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier: will the Premier use any means necessary to break up this monopoly of Nova Scotia Power so customers can finally have competition in this province?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have to say I don't know what the Leader of the Opposition is referring to, but what I will say is this, Mr. Speaker. The Utility and Review Board, of course, is a non-partisan, non-politicized, unbiased committee that looks through the rate filings put in place by through Nova Scotia Power, that provides and relies on expert opinions, relies on the opinions and the advocates of the Consumer Advocates Office, the Small Business Advocates Office, Mr. Speaker, and comes to a decision that seeks to balance the various interests across the province, Mr. Speaker. None of us like to see rate increases. None of us. The simple fact of the matter is, though, the reason why we have rate increases is because previous governments allowed us to continue to be shackled to fossil fuel prices. Coal prices have gone up by 75% in the last 6 years. That's now being reflected in rates, Mr. Speaker. It's unfortunate that past governments didn't have the vision that this government had.
The Honourable Member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We all know the Premier relies on advice of people around him about the economy, advice that has seen us into catastrophic job losses and a crisis in rural Nova Scotia. One of the most prominent members of his economic advisory panel is longtime NDP supporter and career union boss Rick Clark, president of the Nova Scotia Federation of Labour. The Premier made Rick Clark co-chair of the disastrous Labour Management Review Committee, who conducted a sham consultation that excluded the most important job creators in the province. The government will also hear from Mr. Clark this afternoon. My question to the Premier: does he agree with his prominent economic advisor Rick Clark when he says the Michelin bill is a bad piece of legislation and it's not the Michelin bill keeping Michelin in Nova Scotia?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know where the House Leader of the Conservative Party got the quote. What I can tell him is that I have a good relationship with Michelin. We work hard with them to ensure that we recognize that they're a good employer in this province. And of course, Mr. Speaker, I've said in the past that we have no intention of changing any of the elements with respect to that bill. We're not interested. We are not interested in fighting battles of the past, Mr. Speaker. What we are interested in, of course, is ensuring that we have a healthy economy in our province.
The Honourable Member for Argyll on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. By now, all Nova Scotians are aware of the NDP government's reward to their union boss buddies agenda, an agenda that they did not, Mr. Speaker, did not campaign on. First, we had Bill 100, then we had this first contract imposition. Nova Scotia's fear of what's next. No more so than the 3,500 Nova Scotians employed directly by Michelin, the thousands of others whose livelihood depends on Michelin, and the many other thousands of their family members. Mr. Speaker, Michelin alone employs more people than the federal ship contract will at its peak. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is this. What's next on his agenda to reward his more radical friends at the expense of Nova Scotia jobs? Will he simply scrap the Michelin bill or just continue to pull an end run around it, thereby risking the livelihoods of several thousands of Nova Scotians for the sake of rewarding his buddies?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the leader of the Conservative Party a few days ago talked about disgraceful behaviour, and if there ever was disgraceful behaviour in this House, it's that kind of question, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that on this side of the House, we work very hard with all of the employers across the province. We have a good relationship with them. Many of the largest employers, through one way or another, sit on the Premier's Economic Council. They provide advice to this government. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the Jobs Here plan, which the Department of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism brought out, was a product of the work that was done by the very employers that the members opposite refer to.
The honourable member for Argyle on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Premier pledged that he would not raise taxes and then, of course, jacked the HST. Ray Clark told this year's Labour Day rally that there would be no deficits if only the governments in Canada raised taxes. He pledged that he would not run a deficit, but he took a balanced budget and created a huge deficit. He pledged that he would take politics out of paving. He pledged that he would take the politics out of paving, and we know, of course, how that turned out. Pledges he made with his eyes wide open, Mr. Speaker, for the votes, and all promises he has broken time and time again. He claims to be fiscally responsible, and he isn't. He claims to consult. Well, look at what's happening in Bill 102, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Premier is this. Why should the thousands of Nova Scotian families whose very livelihoods are at a risk trust him at all to protect jobs ahead of the interest of Rick Clark and the other buddies on the Michelin bill, or anything else for that matter?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, very proudly, this government has kept every single commitment it made during the last election. Mr. Speaker, that is the truth. Every single commitment.
Order.
Thank you. Thank you.
Order. Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. Order. Order, please. I've asked for order 3 times. The next time I'm going to start removing people of the chamber. Well, I mean, that's the part of the parliamentary procedure here. So that's the last time I'm going to call order 3 times today. Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, they liked it so much, I'll tell them again. We have kept every single commitment we made. Every single one, Mr. Speaker. We came to government with the previous government.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor, please.
Again, Mr. Speaker, we kept every single commitment we made during the last election, Mr. Speaker. But what's worse is we came to government with a government that had left behind a $1.6 billion structural deficit in this province, Mr. Speaker. We turned it around. We not only balanced the books, Mr. Speaker, we ran a surplus and we paid down the debt they left behind.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier, and I'm sure the answers will be just as entertaining in what's turning into comedy hour this afternoon. For the past couple weeks, the Minister of Energy has been unable to answer basic questions about his portfolio, and in fact yesterday the Premier had to jump in to rescue him by answering a very simple question on the electrical tie between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Mr. Speaker, the Premier wants to wait for Lower Churchill to be completed before contacting Hydro-Quebec about importing cheaper power. The Premier said yesterday, and I'll quote, "Once the Lower Churchill project is on track, is online, that will give us the ability to also negotiate with Hydro-Quebec, and if they want to send us cheaper power, we'd be happy to take it." Yet, Hydro-Quebec says they are waiting and eager for the call from this government to see what they can do in help bringing cheaper energy to Nova Scotia today. Mr. Speaker, the Premier must know that such discussions would take time, and waiting for Muskrat Falls to be online will be too late. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Premier make that call to Hydro-Quebec to see what opportunities may exist to get cheaper, clean power for Nova Scotians from Hydro-Quebec?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member misunderstands the manner in which the energy grid in the region operates. Indeed, Emera, who, of course, is the parent company for Nova Scotia Power, regularly does business with Quebec Hydro. In fact, they purchase from Quebec Hydro. When we have a call in this province for additional power, they go out into the marketplace. They look for power which they can import, and in fact, they do at times, Mr. Speaker, bring in power from Quebec or from other cheaper sources if they can access it. So, of course, Mr. Speaker, we're always in the market to make sure that consumers in the province are receiving, the best possible price for their power.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, Nova Scotia Power and Emera bring in small amounts of Hydro-Quebec power now and again at a much higher price than a contracted price which can be negotiated. And even Emera has said it requires the intervention of the Premier or the Energy Minister to make the call that Hydro-Quebec has already said they're waiting for, that they haven't received. Mr. Speaker, the Lower Churchill project is years away. There have already been delays. Construction hasn't started, and even when it arrives, it's only 8 to 10% of our power. Maybe, Mr. Speaker, maybe the Premier and the NDP government members earn enough money to go through another 10 years of price increases from Nova Scotia Power and not worry about it. But a lot of Nova Scotians don't. Hydro-Quebec power averaged into our existing power supplies would actually reduce the cost to customers, and there aren't many options that would do that. So, Mr. Speaker, why is the Premier content to do nothing while he waits for Lower Churchill project to come ashore, rather than contacting Hydro-Quebec today and at least looking at what possibilities exist?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know where the member opposite gets his information. He's just dead wrong on it. The reality is that the transmission interlink, as he knows, between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick needs a substantial upgrade to bring forward any kind of substantial amount of power into the province. That intertie will go ahead as part of the negotiations that are taking place between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. He should know that we, in fact, have already entered into a memorandum of understanding with New Brunswick and are exploring the capacity of those lines to do just exactly what he's suggesting. Except, Mr. Speaker, we did that years before he suggested it.
The honourable member for Dartmouth on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, Hydro-Quebec says there is enough infrastructure in place to do it. So does New Brunswick government. Second, Mr. Speaker, he can take all the credit he wants, and I tabled that memorandum of understanding in the announcement yesterday, so of course I'm aware of it. And in fact, the leader of the official opposition said that that was necessary during the election, and this Premier laughed at him during the election for making that suggestion. So we're just glad he finally took that advice. Mr. Speaker, the other day, the Premier called Muskrat Falls a game changer, and just a few minutes ago in question period, he said it's going to create thousands and thousands of jobs. Well, you know what? We all know that it is a game changer for Newfoundland and Labrador. We all know that there will be thousands of jobs in Newfoundland and Labrador. Yes, of course there are benefits to Nova Scotia from having more stably priced electricity, but the Premier is misleading Nova Scotians when he talks about thousands of jobs and so forth. So, Mr. Speaker, if the Premier would be forthright with Nova Scotians about it, he might actually have some credibility on the issue. So, Mr. Speaker, why does the Premier refuse to talk to Hydro-Quebec and continue to tell Nova Scotians all their energy problems will be solved when Lower Churchill comes ashore, when he knows it's years off and it's higher priced than what we're actually paying now?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I don't refuse to talk to anybody, and as he knows, and he's already said that Quebec Hydro, in fact, already does sell into the marketplace. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to be really clear. I was in Cape Breton on Monday. I set out the terms, the memorandum of understanding with the Lower Churchill project. There will be thousands of jobs created as a result of that, thousands of person-years of work, and Cape Breton companies are the best and most strategically placed in order to take advantage of that, Mr. Speaker. They should be proud of this deal. They should be telling businesses in this province to make sure they get into that supply chain, Mr. Speaker, instead of being what they are, Mr. Speaker, the nodding nabob of negativism.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Commentary on allnovascotia.com today says, after weeks of getting roasted over rural job losses, the NDP government is desperately trying to build an impression of economic momentum. This week, the minister celebrated the first anniversary of his failed jobs plan, but the fact is the shipbuilding contract will not even bring enough jobs to fill the gap that the number of jobs that have been lost under this government in rural Nova Scotia. If this government continues this way, it will screw up the important opportunity we have in front of us. Mr. Speaker, my question to you, the Minister of Economic Development and Tourism, what diversion tactic will this minister use next to try and give the impression that he's building economic momentum rather than focusing on things within his control to improve our business climate in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, over a year ago, with deep consultation, I can remember it very, very well. Donald Savoie, a very well-known economist and researcher, known throughout Atlantic Canada, if not throughout Canada itself. Following his lead, Mr. Speaker, we developed a very comprehensive plan. And yes, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite is correct. It's called Jobs Here. That is our way to grow the economy here in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, we are doing just that. And Mr. Speaker, I can remember yesterday I compared the unemployment rate when we took over as government, Mr. Speaker, as being somewhere around, and I think it was somewhere around 11%, Mr. Speaker. And I also mentioned yesterday that under our guidance and our leadership, that unemployment rate now is at 8.2%, Mr. Speaker. So it is working, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Cape Breton North on his first supplementary.
Yesterday, the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism said, members from the opposite party take the job losses, things that are out of control of Nova Scotians, and use it for political gain. Mr. Speaker, job losses are the reality in rural Nova Scotia. By ignoring this situation, this government has sent a message to them that they don't care about the people suffering in rural Nova Scotia. This minister is more interested in lecturing the opposition rather than getting down to business and creating an environment for businesses to grow. Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the minister is, will the minister put his own ego aside, recognize that we have a job crisis in rural Nova Scotia, stand up to this cabinet by saying this is not the time to ram more economic uncertainty down the throats of our job creators through its payback special interest laws?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, it's amazing when I hear members of the opposition stand up and talk about eagles, and I would think that there are some members that are opposite that could write a book on eagles. Mr. Speaker, we have a strategy, Mr. Speaker. I'll stand here time and time again and brag and boast about the strategy that is working. And again, Mr. Speaker, I reiterate, is that no one, and I would like to think no one on either side of the House wants to see a job loss in the province of Nova Scotia, not one single job. However, I still maintain, Mr. Speaker, that it's certainly not appropriate, nor is it fair for anyone to take advantage of those individuals that have lost jobs, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this government in the first 2 years of its mandate has been targeting small businesses and making uncertainty for entire industries like pharmacy owners, road builders, insurance brokers and other non-unionized employers. Now big employers like Michelin with almost 4,000 jobs and Sobeys with its 10,000 jobs are coming forward to take aim at this government's poor economic handling of our province. These major employers are saying they may think twice about future investments in our province because of this government's misguided policies, and this comes at a time when we cannot afford to lose not another single job. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister: will the Minister admit that he's failed job creators in Nova Scotia and the people they employ by not standing up for sound economic policies that will help our province's economy grow?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to stand in my place and talk about the relationship that this government has with the Irvings of the world, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to stand in my place and talk about the relationship that this government has with Michelin, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have a relationship with those companies that would be the envy of many other jurisdictions, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to work with them, to collaborate with them, and continue to make Nova Scotia a better place to live, to raise a family, and a better place to play. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism has spent a lot of time discussing unemployment rates in this House, and he's mentioned them again today. We've lost 6,600 jobs in rural Nova Scotia, and 9,800 people have left rural Nova Scotia's workforce in the last year. We are facing two significant challenges in this province, whether or not the Premier will recognize it: job losses and a shrinking workforce. My question is a simple one for the Minister of Economic, Rural Development and Tourism. For the clarity of this House, will the Minister explain how the unemployment rate is calculated in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what I do is, like everybody else, I rely upon researchers. I do research myself. I rely upon Stats Canada. I do all those things that we all have access to, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've mentioned here in the House that under a Liberal government that in certain regions of the province that unemployment peaked to well in excess of 20%, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 8.1% right now in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister likes glossing over the fact that 14,800 workers have left the labour force since he became a minister. 14,800 fewer people in the labour force since the government took office, and 9,800 fewer people in rural Nova Scotia's labour force. We are losing people and we are losing jobs, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Economic, Rural Development and Tourism. Will the Minister explain how he calculates the unemployment rate if he doesn't acknowledge our shrinking labour force?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, lowest unemployment rate in Atlantic Canada exists right here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we repeatedly hear the minister stand and say our unemployment rate is the lowest in Atlantic Canada once again. Yes, congratulations, that's fantastic that they don't understand the relationship between the number unemployed and the total labour force. That's the definition you're looking for. That's what the minister should understand. Our unemployment rate is low because we've lost people from our workforce. It's that simple. That's how that number is staying where it is. So there's no way the government should be taking credit for this number. 12,500 fewer jobs and 14,800 fewer people in the workforce in rural Nova Scotia since this government took office. 6,600 fewer jobs and 9,800 fewer people in rural Nova Scotia's labour force last year, Mr. Speaker. So my question is for the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism. Will this minister explain how the unemployment rate is calculated in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not convinced that everybody is aware that there's a global recession that's been happening around the world. Mr. Speaker, we all know that there have been job losses, not only here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, right across Canada and in Europe, in the United States, all over the world, Mr. Speaker. But there are things, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to certain job losses that are just simply out of our control, Mr. Speaker. We have no control over what's going on in Europe. We have no control over what's going on in the United States of America, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and again, it's a reiteration of, it's rather unfortunate that we try to have political rhetoric around the unfortunes of certain Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is through you to the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, the government announced recently that they're pumping money into renal dialysis in Halifax. Yet the community of Windsor, which is much closer to home for a great many who raised money for their own dialysis unit, got nothing. My question to the Minister, when will the Minister learn that the people who, together with their families, have to undergo grueling dialysis treatment can be much better served by making the investment close to them and not making them travel the unreasonable distances?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for raising a really important question. Mr. Speaker, people who suffer with kidney failure and require dialysis are a really important population to provide services to in the province of Nova Scotia. It is not the case, though, that this government is pumping money into Halifax and not the rest of the province. In fact, Mr. Speaker, we invested more money into providing registered nurses and the satellite clinics across Nova Scotia outside of Halifax. And what that means is that patients with complex cases who are being seen here in Metro are now able to be returned to their home satellite dialysis clinic where they can be seen there. And in addition, we are updating the renal dialysis program here in Halifax. This will enable a number of initiatives, including an expansion of people with complex cases that can be seen here, but also it will allow us to do more training for home dialysis, so that in fact people in Nova Scotia will be able to have dialysis right in their own homes, a very effective way to get dialysis for those patients for whom that form of dialysis will work very well.
The Honourable Member for Hants West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Deputy Premier said in a government release, receiving this care closer to home will make life better for Nova Scotians living with kidney disease and their families. Does the Minister not agree with her Cabinet colleague, and will she acknowledge that the same point holds true for those in Hants County who have to drive right by their own local hospital to get to Halifax? And as far as I know, Mr. Speaker is prepared to work with the organization in Windsor West Hants to set up a satellite dialysis unit.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have 11 satellites around the province, in addition to a number of regional sites and centres. We are identifying all the time through our assessment where people in the province live who require dialysis. We are trying to get a plan in place that ensures that people do not have to travel for any greater period of time than an hour from their home. The establishment of new satellite dialysis clinics, Mr. Speaker, is something that certainly would require a significant amount of additional not only financial resources but health human resources into the system, Mr. Speaker. And as we stabilize the sites that we currently have, improve on the tertiary care site, we will be in a better position to determine where future satellites should be in the province, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Hants West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Dr. Tom Hewlett, Chair of the Department of Medicine at the Cape Breton District Health Authority, said in a government release, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker, as there were 2 quotes from that, "We always put a high priority on treating patients as close to home as possible." Dr. Hewlett also equates less travel and fewer expenses for our patients and families with helping to reduce the burden of illness. Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Minister. When will this government abandon its stubborn refusal to apply the same principle to the people in Hants County who sacrificed a great deal to raise money for their own dialysis machine, and will this minister commit to coming out and explaining exactly that to these individuals?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I indicated, there are people all across the province who travel both to satellite clinics and also here into the tertiary care centre. We have a plan to improve and enhance dialysis services. We have invested several millions of dollars into making those improvements, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to make improvements and evaluate the need for services on a go-forward basis, Mr. Speaker. And as I indicated, some of the money that we have invested in the tertiary centre here in Halifax will allow training for home dialysis. This province does not utilize that form of dialysis anywhere close to the national average. And Mr. Speaker, we are going to work very hard to ensure that people can get dialysis service not only as close to home as possible, but where they can medically within their homes, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier has indicated that he will be introducing legislation which will make changes to lobbyist registration in our province. From all indications, these changes will leave a large loophole, specifically key party operatives such as staff in the Premier's office, ministerial aides and caucus staff. These individuals will not be covered by any restrictions on lobbying government. But my question is, why would the Premier not include senior political staff in his changes to restrictions on lobbying in our province?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the member is speculating about potential legislation. All I can say is we'll have to wait until the legislation actually comes forward.
The honourable member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this is an issue on the minds of Nova Scotians because we currently have the former provincial secretary of the NDP now lobbying the very government he used to work for, the NDP government for which he held the top post for 4 years. Clearly, as a person who has the ear of the Premier, the Cabinet and top staffers within the Premier's office. Mr. Speaker, the Premier has publicly stated that Ed Wark does not have insider information, yet is the same person that the Premier dismissed over the election financing cover-up from within the NDP. Speaker, is rich for the Premier to suggest that the person who failed to return $10,000 in illegal donations to the NDP is not in a position of conflict lobbying so soon after having been dismissed for violating the Elections Act. So, Speaker, how can the Premier state that the ultimate insider would have no inside knowledge of the NDP cabinet and its staffers?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the person he's referring to never ever worked for the NDP government.
The honourable member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you. I want to thank the Premier for allowing me to correct that, because Ed Wark worked for the NDP party for 4 years as their secretary, and I want to thank my leader for correcting me. It was not $10,000 that the NDP accepted in legal donations. It was $50,000 that they accepted in legal donations. The $10,000 was the fine that they were given from the Chief Electoral Officer for violating the Elections Act. So thank you for the opportunity to be able to clear that up. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians expect transparency in those who are lobbying government to try to obtain contracts or funding from this government. Nova Scotia was one of the first provinces to bring in a Lobbyist Registration Act, and yet today the Premier feels that someone who held the top position in the NDP party somehow does not have inside knowledge of government or of the ministers involved that he was so closely aligned with before being fired by the Premier. So my question is, will the Premier commit today to including people such as Ed Wark in any new changes to the Lobbyist Registration Act in Nova Scotia?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, lobbyist registration usually refers to people who are actually employed by government, not employed by private organizations. I want to ensure, of course, that the record is correct, and of course, in fact, Mr. Wark, I believe, resigned and was not fired. And finally, of course, the findings of the Chief Electoral Officer was that the party knew, in fact, nothing about the background or the receipt of any money. Mr. Speaker, that is the facts.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Education. In response to my question yesterday regarding the HOG formula and the allocation of funds to school boards, the Minister responded, and I quote, "The formula and budget considerations are two separate things." And, Mr. Speaker, I couldn't agree more, and most people in the House would know they are two separate things. The issue, Mr. Speaker, is that the question made no reference to budget considerations. So, Mr. Speaker, for the information of all members of the House and for clarification regarding the HOG formula, I would like to quote from the department's own document, which describes the formula, and it says the HOG formula was developed to allocate P-12 funding, and it also goes on to say, and I quote, "Whatever funds government commits to the P-12 system is what's allocated through the HOG formula." So my question to the Minister is this: now that we're clear on what the HOG formula is and that it is the allocation of funding, what effect, if any, will the results of the current HOG formula review have on the allocation of funds to school boards in 2012-13?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to clarify around the formula and the budget. The budget target is, for the want of a better description, the pie, and the formula, the HOG formula, is the way you cut the pie. So the HOG formula at this time is being revised with the collaboration of all of the school boards. We're still working on that tool, the tool that will be working with the budget that we will be coming forward with. That decision has not been made. So the pie, the decision hasn't been made, and we're working on the tool to cut the pie. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know how many times we have to talk about the funding formula and the HOG formula, and you know, cutting the pie to me is allocating parts of the pie to school boards. So I think maybe we understand that the HOG formula and cutting the pie are the same thing. So, Mr. Speaker, proposed...
Yeah, we got it, Clary. Thanks.
Motherhood and apple pie. Right. Mr. Speaker, proposed changes to the funding formula speak to isolated schools. At Public Accounts this morning, there was a healthy discussion about the definition of isolated schools, and following my questions regarding that definition, I was keenly interested in similar questions from the member from Colchester-Musquodoboit Valley, who I know cares about small isolated schools and small isolated communities. Every board has isolated schools and communities. Every board will be impacted by the definition of the word isolated used in the formula. So my question to the minister is this: what is her definition of isolated school?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much. As everyone knows, the HOG formula is now under revision to make sure that we are allocating funds appropriately for our changing demographics. And also the school boards have come forward with their focuses, how they would like to have the formula revised. At this time, we are working on the issue of small and isolated school. And I would like to add that I know that every member in this House values their small schools and they're in the communities. We have still not have made the definition of isolated, small isolated schools. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe in the review of the HOG formula, they separate small from isolated. There are two different categories of schools, small schools and isolated schools. With the geography of Nova Scotia, we have many communities and we have many isolated communities. Students currently often travel up to 50 minutes one way to reach their school. And many times, Mr. Speaker, the road conditions are not good. They're country roads, they're gravel roads, they're narrow roads, and many of them have twists and turns. And in the wintertime, even though we have a wonderful snow removal program, thanks to the minister over there, when we get the graders purchased, I might add, the minister. So my question to the minister is this: once the review is completed, we know that the minister will either reject or accept the recommendations of the HOG formula. So my question to the minister is this: will the minister ensure that the definition of isolated school, when it becomes part of the HOG formula, speaks to the age of the student on the bus, the student safety on rural roads, student travel time, and distance? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, and thank you for highlighting those very important points. Nova Scotia is a very interesting province. We have, very small rural communities, and there are major challenges of declining enrollment too. So I will make a commitment that as this formula is being revised, that I am listening to all the voices from our school boards and all of the considerations around any of the changes and revisions we make with the HOG formula. And thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Thursday, the former Canadian Forces station in Shelburne was auctioned off for approximately $125,000. This was in addition to SWASDA's remaining assets, which were also auctioned off that day. Mr. Speaker, there are many questions which are still left with this whole issue, which the minister has yet to address. Will the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism outline how much was paid by the province with regards to auctioneers and legal fees, and how much money from the auction the province expects to receive?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, off the top of my head, I don't know what the cost of that action was, but I can tell you this: is that my expectation is that as a result of that auction, that I'd be very surprised if we receive any money whatsoever.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
Okay. Did the minister say they weren't going to receive any money from the auction? Okay. Well, in the spring session of the legislature, it was brought to our attention that the NDP was using heavy-handed tactics to ensure that, I believe it was Royal Bank, received money that was owed to them by SWASDA. Yet this government has yet to act to support the small local businesses that are also owed money by SWASDA, along with former employees. Will the minister take action? What action is the minister taking to ensure that local businesses and the former employees are going to be compensated appropriately with regards to the wind-up of SWASDA?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with respect to SWASDA and the auction, there's a legal process that's in place, Mr. Speaker, and we're allowing that process to play itself out. We will not interfere with the legal process in this province, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering if that process was in place when this government paid the banks off. Before they paid off the small businesses and the employees in Yarmouth, there are over 50 small businesses that are owed money from SWASDA, and to date, this government hasn't done anything to support them. For once, will this minister do something to support small business in the province and provide help to these businesses that need to have their money returned to them?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, this government came to power, recognized that there were some issues with SWASDA, Mr. Speaker, and we took action to remedy that, Mr. Speaker, something that previous governments would not do while they were in power, Mr. Speaker. And furthermore, Mr. Speaker, what we've done is we've authorized a forensic audit of SWASDA, trying to reveal where those monies have gone to, monies that we taxpayers' money have devoted and dedicated to SWASDA, which didn't go to the causes that they were dedicated for, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, with the 2011 fall lobster season now underway, Nova Scotians who depend on this lucrative fishery are already concerned about the predicted low price of lobster. My question is, what is the Minister of Fisheries' plan to address low prices for lobster in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I respect the question opposite. As the member opposite knows, there is low prices being affected all along our coast. District 35 in the Upper Bay of Fundy has just recently been involved with very high catches, historical highs. The neighbours to the south for the September-October season are also in very soft prices. I'm very aware of this, but we are working with our Lobster Council, Mr. Speaker, and we are very aware of the different options that's available to the industry. The industry is discussing these options as we speak, as these other districts open up, and there's ongoing dialogue, and I look forward to assisting them in any way. Thank you for the question.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, as the Minister well knows, this is not a new issue to Nova Scotia, but when it happened a few years ago, the price of lobster was much lower. Efforts were undertaken to try to identify new markets, to look at value added for the lobster industry, because we all know it's in our whole province's interest that lobster fishermen get a good price for their lobster, because our economy relies upon it. So my question to the Minister is, what new initiatives has this government put in place to identify new markets or value-added initiatives to get a better price for Nova Scotia lobster?
The Honourable the Minister of Fisheries.
Again, Mr. Speaker, to the member opposite, there's a lot going on as we speak. There's discussions with the industry Atlantic-wide, with our 5 provinces, including Nova Scotia, regarding the Lobster Council and all the different options available to the industry. And yes, I agree with the member opposite. Since 2008, the industry as a whole has suffered very low prices, what we see in the marketplace. And there's a lot of work being done by our department, whether it's nationally or internationally about developing markets in Asia and China, and all this is going on as we speak. And again, I look forward to having these discussions with the industry as we move forward. Thank you for the question.
The honourable member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when the NDP were in opposition, they continued to ask governments of the day for a plan on how they were going to deal with problems. And I know that the government in limited instances has tried to present plans on how they're going to deal with certain problems. We have differences of opinion as to how they're succeeding, but the question I have is that in light of the problems that exist with the lobster industry, that this is not something new, but something that's been tackled by the previous government and now this government, will the Minister of Fisheries present a plan to this House as to how his government plans on dealing with low lobster prices in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. To the member opposite, I very clearly remember sitting on that side of the House in opposition and asked the third party presently to introduce a task force to deal with these issues as we speak. This minister, this government took action. We got the discussion going regarding the Lobster Council. There is discussion going on with our Atlantic friends, and these are options that the industry needs to explore, needs to digest. I look forward to taking that leadership role, and we'll make life better for Nova Scotians. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, outside this chamber in the Ledge Council office, confusion is now reigning as those who wanted to appear before his committee, who this morning were told they can't appear before his committee.
I just ruled that out of order a little earlier, so I'll not allow it again for the second time. No.
I'll rephrase.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Justice. Can he tell the House whether those Nova Scotians who wish to speak up this afternoon and were told no are able to do so on the original schedule now if tomorrow?
It's still out of order. You're asking the committee chair to answer a question that I just ruled on earlier. It's out of order. If you want to rephrase the question, go right ahead, but you can't ask the question of the chair of the committee. I ruled that out of order earlier. No. I ruled that earlier. I gave the ruling. If you want to check hands right after the sitting, feel free to do so. Well, rephrase the question, or that's it. I'll move on. Yes.
When can Nova Scotians?
What's that?
Up here. Up here. Okay.
Would the minister inform the House what the plan is to hear from those Nova Scotians that wish to speak on this important issue?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. This evening we will exhaust our list as best we can, and for anyone that has had their name on that list and that does not get the opportunity to speak tonight, I will be more than pleased to see that we get the opportunity to meet with them tomorrow and hear their points of view.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm obviously pleased to hear that, but I do want to follow up and ask the Minister of Justice who told him to change it the first time around and who told him to put it back this time around.
Mr. Speaker.
It's out of order again because I'll read the same thing again and maybe we can digest it here this afternoon, okay? Okay, I'll read it again. Questions to ministers or to the committee chair concerning the proceedings of work of the committee. When a question has been asked about a committee's proceedings, speakers have encouraged members to rephrase their question. So do you understand what I'm saying? Thank you very much. So would you please rephrase the question?
How long do they have? How long do they have to present?
Mr. Speaker, how long do these people have to present?
It's still out of order. Geez. I'm going to move on to the next question, okay? The Honourable Member for the Halifax-Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is going to be for the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as the Premier is aware, the single most important tool that Nova Scotia has with regard to increasing immigration is our provincial nominee program. These tailor-made nominee programs have been successful in attracting immigrants in other provinces that traditionally have had challenges in doing so, and they've enabled those provinces to both enrich their communities and also improve their economies. Mr. Speaker, the Nova Scotia level has been capped in recent years, as we know, just in the last year, and the Premier said that he had spoken to both the Prime Minister and met with the Immigration Minister when he was in Ottawa recently. My question to the Premier is, given the efforts of the Premier to date, will the Premier confirm that the Nova Scotia cap on the provincial nominee program for 2012 still remains at 500?
Honourable the Premier.
I want to thank the honourable member for an appropriate phrased and well-put question. Mr. Speaker, what I can say, Mr. Speaker, is that I have had the opportunity, as was indicated by the member, to meet with both the Prime Minister and with the Minister responsible. I have pointed out, in fact, in very similar words, what the member of the official opposition has said in relation to the program. I've asked him to consider a series of changes, recognizing that this was, in fact, the first year we actually hit the 500 nominee target, so that we, Nova Scotia, would be able to recruit more immigrants. He has suggested a number of other streams which we are investigating as well. Obviously, in the end, the question is, how do we encourage more of the immigrant population to come to the province, and we're working diligently to try and make sure that that happens.
The honourable member for Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I was looking to see if indeed he could confirm the 500. I'm not sure that that was entirely confirmed, but my understanding is that we are capped again for 2012 at 500 nominees or nominee families. Mr. Speaker, the Premier knows full well that the provincial nominee program allows the province to go out and market itself to the world. There's no other stream of immigration that enables the province to control its own destiny and ultimately its success in immigration. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to be able to table the only letter that was sent by any member of this government with regard to raising the cap. It's a joint letter from the 4 premiers dated months after the government implemented the cap, the federal government that is, and nowhere does the letter specifically request an increase in the cap allotments for Nova Scotia, or for that matter for any of the other 3 Atlantic provinces. My question to the Minister is, why did the only letter sent by the Premier, why did the only letter sent by the Premier not specifically request an increase to Nova Scotia's provincial nominee cap?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, there was the joint opinion of the premiers of Atlantic Canada that the caps on immigration on the nominee program would be detrimental to all of the provinces in the region. So that was sent for that reason. With respect to the submissions that were made to the Prime Minister and to the Minister of Immigration, they were made personally by me, asking them to increase the nominee level to the province. And I should explain to the member opposite the reason why the cap, which is in place, and whether or not it will be renewed, I don't think a final decision has been made on that. But if it will be renewed, here's why. The federal government has capped overall the number of immigrants that it intends to bring into the country. Right? They are not going to expand that pool. So what they have said is that all of the provinces and territories have their own levels that have been set. The federal government has the level that they have set. So any increase in any of the numbers, any of the cap, means that the province must either take from the federal government or take from one of the other provinces, which, as you can see, would not be acceptable to either the federal government or the other provinces. What I can say is that the province has got allocations of additional seats or additional numbers that have not been used by the other provinces.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we certainly know, and the Premier knows as well, that this is one of the most important issues facing our province because we have demographic problems, we have an aging population, we have outmigration, which we've talked about here a great deal around the jobs. Mr. Speaker, the provinces of Manitoba, Alberta, Saskatchewan and BC, just to name 4, have had significant increases. 400, 600, 300. BC has 300 more nominees as well. Those provinces understood the same formula. Those provinces lobbied hard and got what they needed for their province. That's an increase in numbers within the pie, as the other minister likes to speak about. All achieved it because their provinces and the governments in their provinces fought. And my question to the Premier is, given that Nova Scotia has seen no increase and will again in 2012 see no increase in our nominee allotment, what will it take to make the Premier recognize the current strategy is failing?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I understand it, the Minister of Immigration has announced that all of the nominee programs have been capped and not changed for any of the provinces, Mr. Speaker. And in fact, the simple fact of the matter is that until last year, the province of Nova Scotia did not use the number of nominees that it was given. So this government was the first government to actually use the number of nominees that were allocated. In addition, Mr. Speaker, there are nominee quotas that have been assigned to the other provinces, and this year, because some of them were not used, the province of Nova Scotia was able to access some of the unused nominee program in other provinces, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Immigration is well aware of the desire of this province to increase the overall number of nominees. Ultimately, though, it is a decision of the federal government.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, 3,241 residents of the Annapolis Valley signed a petition. Thousands more have spoken. They recognize that changes to physician coverage at the Berwick Clinic, which the Minister of Health and Wellness approved, will have an effect on the health care delivery system throughout the entire valley. Since the Berwick Clinic was functioning well, it was serving 22,000 patients a year, and most importantly, a model of collaborative care, and was reducing pressures on the local and regional emergency rooms. My question to the Minister, why did the Minister approve a reduction of hours in a medical clinic she simply wants to see more of in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I was pleased to have an opportunity to go to Berwick and tour the clinic, meet with staff, meet with people from the community. And Mr. Speaker, that was after I had already met with a delegation from the community earlier. And indeed, the Berwick Clinic is it's a very impressive small facility, and it's of great importance to Berwick and surrounding communities. Mr. Speaker, it still is not a model of collaborative care, although I'm hoping it will be now that our government have approved a nurse practitioner to be added into collaborative practice there. What was occurring, Mr. Speaker, was that physicians were closing their doctors' offices during the day and operating the clinic during the day. What we have done is we have approved a plan where doctors will be back in their offices during the day and working in the clinic in the evenings and on weekends, extending those hours. And when the nurse practitioner is recruited, then a more collaborative model of practice will be able to be in place in that clinic, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If only it were working. Mr. Speaker, health dollars saved as a result of this decision. On paper, 125,000 in this half year, 250,000 per year. Even board members have indicated this won't be realized. Cost pressures associated with clogged emergency rooms will be far greater than cost saved. On September 16, the Minister of Health met with officials from Berwick, and at the time the Minister committed to full consultation on the issue prior to changes made to the operation in October. Since that September meeting, the community heard nothing and officials were not consulted. My question to the Minister, why did the Minister commit to further consultations when in fact nothing took place?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm just trying to remember who was at that meeting. I don't believe the honourable member was at the meeting. I don't know why he thinks I committed to full consultations. My recollection, Mr. Speaker, is that I encouraged the delegation that I met with, of which the honourable member wasn't a part, to return to their community and collaborate with the Annapolis Valley District Health Authority, which deliver the services there. And I indicated to the delegation that I would encourage the District Health Authority to collaborate with those individuals, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, you know, for those who are listening to this important question today, I want to clarify I was indeed with the Minister and the Deputy Minister on that day, heard exactly what was going to take place, and there was going to be additional consultation, which did not take place. It did not take place from the DHA. The damage is being felt as we speak. The changes have occurred. Local emergency rooms are closing three times since the new beginnings at Berwick. Wait times at other ERs have increased. Over the last 2 weeks, some patients waited 7 to 10 hours. One needing a cast waited 6 hours one day, 10 hours the next day. And let's not forget, Mr. Speaker, 22,000 patients who were receiving excellent care and now have to find their way into other more expensive components of the healthcare system or go without care at all. My question to the Minister, will she admit that the decision to change the hours of the Berwick Clinic was short-sighted and commit to reviewing this decision?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a very well-functioning clinic. It will continue to be a well-functioning clinic. There are additional resources being put into that clinic for a nurse practitioner. And Mr. Speaker, I want to remind the honourable member that that was once a well-functioning hospital, and that hospital was closed by the Liberal government, Mr. Speaker. And if anybody did damage to the communities of Berwick and surrounding areas by withdrawing services to local people, Mr. Speaker, it is not this government. It was a former Liberal government, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Natural Resources. Would he please tell us his definition for a clear cut?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It must be the last question of the day. I think we've come to this, but you know, we certainly know that clear cutting has gone on in the province for far too long at too high a rate. In fact, it's around 96% of clear cutting, and that's what Nova Scotians said they no longer want. And we had a full review through the Natural Resources Strategy, and Nova Scotians told us over and over they wanted a change in the clear cutting practices in this province, and that's exactly what we've done through the Path We Share, a Natural Resources Strategy for Nova Scotia. We've come up with two definitions. One is a layman's term, basically the removal of all trees on an area except for those that are under the wildlife or watercourse regulations. And if I have time, I'll get into the more detailed as we go along.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it's surprising the minister would make light of such an important issue to so many people. As the minister... Mr. Speaker, the fact is, the former minister committed to reduce clear cutting by 50% and ban whole tree harvesting. Yet the definition that the government has introduced for clear cutting pretty much allows anything. There's very little that's considered a clear cut. Mr. Speaker, I will table an image depiction that's been done by a professional forester showing the difference between a clear cut and a non-clear cut according to the NDP government's own definition. There's very little difference. Mr. Speaker, the fact is that they have not lived up to the commitment that people thought they would live up to. So, Mr. Speaker, why did the NDP mislead Nova Scotians about their intentions to reduce clear cutting when their true intentions were really to define clear cutting in such a way that anything would still be allowed?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know, Nova Scotians care about their woodlands, care about their forest, and you know, this government cares about our forestry practices in this province. And we had a very comprehensive three-phase strategy session that listened to Nova Scotians, listened to experts in the field, and then, and as you know, we come out in August with the Path We Share, a natural resources strategy for Nova Scotia, 2011 to 2020. And it lays clearly out there that the clear-cutting practices in this province are not acceptable, and that we have a goal now of 50% clear-cutting only within a 5-year frame. The clock is ticking on that, and we are working on it. So we have a clear definition of where we're going. We have a vision for forestry in this province, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The time allotted for oral questions put by members to Minister has expired. I will now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, on May 20th, 2009, the Premier said, and I quote from the Chronicle Herald, quote, "We're not going to raise taxes." On April 6, 2010, I have a budget bulletin here, which says, and I quote, "The provincial budget of 2010, less than a year later, outlines tax changes, including a restoration of the harmonized sales tax to 15%. I'll table both documents for the view of the House. Mr. Speaker, 3 times in question period today, the Premier said he's kept all his promises. That's clearly misleading, and I ask that he withdraw those remarks.
I'm sorry, but that is not a point of order. That's a disagreement between 2 members over facts. I will now recognize the House Leader for the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I rise firstly on a point of privilege.
Point of privilege?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. The discussion that's taken place regarding law amendments, it seems to be some confusion in government's responses to the questions asked today, and it's unclear still how many the government has relented on that will be heard from tomorrow. So I've put this in written form so you can rule on it at your leisure, Mr. Speaker, and then there'll be a form for the clerk. The government's move to curtail debate at Law Amendments Committee is violating the privilege of freedom of speech provided to all members in this House, and it could be argued that it is also violating the same privilege afforded to witnesses at law amendments as they are guests of the legislature while they are witnesses to the committee. On the first point, the most important privilege granted to members is that of freedom of speech within debate. This is the most essential element of debate in the House and has been recognized as such for hundreds of years within the British parliamentary system of government. For the government to curtail debate at Law Amendments Committee at the last minute and to restrict presentations to the committee means that members will not be able to effectively present the opinions and facts of Nova Scotians. If I am not able to hear from all Nova Scotians, I am not able to fully debate this issue in the House. No member in this House is. On the second point, and I'll be brief, Mr. Speaker, witnesses to committees are afforded similar privilege when called to testify before committee. If they cannot fully prepare due to the last-minute curtailment, it could be argued that their privilege has been violated as well. Presenters will not be able to effectively prepare and